that kind of game.
Godlike.
We are controlling transmission.
1994 was an amazing year to be a fighting game fan. Whether it was in arcades or on home consoles, we were inundated with one amazing brawler after another, both in 2D and 3D varieties, each attempting to top the games that came before it. Many of us were still playing games like Mortal Kombat 2 and Samurai Showdown, but this was the year that brought us such classics as the King of Fighters 94, Tekken, Virtua Fighter 2, Darkstalkers, and the all-time classic that is Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo.
Never mind that shit. Here comes
Killer Instinct.
When Killer Instinct was unleashed upon arcades on October 28, 1994, it blew everyone away at the time with its amazing graphics, super smooth gameplay, intense music, and bone-crunching sound effects. And as an 8-year-old kid laying my eyes on this thing for the first time, it was honestly kinda hard to believe that video games could reach this level of badassness. Which I don't think is even a word, but it's hard to think of a better one to describe KI. Except maybe for
Awesome!
Interestingly enough though, Killer Instinct started off as more of a side project at Rare in the early 90s. Just something they were playing around with in the background while they worked on bigger IPs. They had recently come into possession of a Silicon graphics workstation which made it possible to create detailed 3D characters and worlds, and they were putting it to good use on the production of Donkey Kong Country. When representatives from Nintendo were paying Rare a visit to see an early build of DK Country, they were also shown a pre-alpha build of a project tentatively called Brute Force. They only had a few character designs and a very rough gameplay engine, but it was enough to convince Nintendo to jump into the fighting game world, as a slick-looking, fast-playing arcade fighter would be a great way to build hype for the upcoming Ultra 64 game console they'd recently been developing. And with that, Brute Force became Killer Instinct, and the world would never be the same. The plot in Killer Instinct was pretty thin, which was the case for most fighting games at the time, and honestly still is. But it told the story of a massive global corporate entity called Ultratech that held an annual fighting tournament dubbed Killer Instinct, which pit ordinary human martial artists against the company's many experiments in the fields of genetic engineering and robotics. Even to the point that they've pioneered interdimensional travel and retrieved a two-headed centaur cyclops thing to be the tournament's final big bad. The simple story set the stage for what had to be one of the wildest cast of characters to ever grace a fighting game. You of course get old standbys like a ninja, a boxer, and the classic femme fatale. But you also get a werewolf, a dinosaur, characters literally made of fire and ice, a reanimated skeleton warrior ripped straight out of Jason and the Argonauts, and this game's own poster boy, Fulgore, a robotic maniac armed to the teeth with wrist blades, laser eyes, and a primal scream that makes even the most battle-tested warriors shit their pants in fear.
Ultimate.
The gameplay in Killer Instinct was somewhat revolutionary back in 1994, blending elements of other games that had stood the test of time, such as special move commands that mirrored Street Fighter and finishing moves similar to Mortal Kombat, but also featuring a much greater emphasis on speed and stringing together ridiculous combos, and being rewarded for your efforts with the announcer screaming at the top of his lungs each time you pull one off. Another feature that helped KI stand out is that there was no round system. instead giving both players 2 health bars, and as soon as one is depleted, you're back on your feet and right back to the fighting, limiting the break in the action, and also not refilling the health of the other player, leaving the door open for the coveted supreme victory, bestowed upon players that can make it through a fight without depleting their first health bar, which again is a cool little reward and also something to throw in the face of your disgraced opponents. With such fast-paced and intense gameplay, it stands to reason that KI would also need some intense music to complement the action. And oh boy, does it have that in spades. The music in Killer Instinct is the stuff of legends, and oddly enough, it was composed by 2 guys who at the time were just breaking into the industry. KI's soundtrack blends elements of techno, hip-hop, industrial metal, and straight-up thrash metal to generate a sound that is at once all over the map, but when paired with their respective stages and characters, comes together to create a perfect atmosphere for kicking some serious ass. And this is music that is perfectly listenable even when not playing the game, which is why it received a CD release in 1995 under the title Killer Cuts.
Killer feeling, such a feeling, such a feeling, such a feeling. Killer, killer, ooh, she's a killer, 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 ooh, killer.
The aspect of Killer Instinct that immediately grabbed people's attention, though, was the visuals. The 3D character models, detailed stages, and dynamic camera made for a very striking and impressive visual presentation, so it's no wonder that Nintendo settled on this game to be a big promo for the Ultra 64, later to be renamed the Nintendo 64. Oddly enough though, the original Killer Instinct never did make an appearance on Nintendo's 64-bit console, but in 1995 it did receive a port to the SNES. This 16-bit version of Killer Instinct, aside from the obvious graphical downgrades that had to be implemented, is a really great port, all things considered. The visuals went through kind of a Donkey Kong Country process, taking fully 3D models and retooling them into sprites, and they still look pretty damn good, with this being one of the best looking games in the SNES library actually. The gameplay is more or less unchanged, featuring all of the combos, special moves, and other gameplay mechanics from the arcade game, and the soundtrack also translated nicely onto the SNES, lacking the impact that the arcade OST had, but still being very listenable. And this is the version I played most as a kid, and I loved it. I wouldn't say I liked it more than Street Fighter, but it did give Mortal Kombat a run for its money. Eventually, there was even a Gameboy port, and if the SNES game was a step down from the arcade, this is about 10 steps down. But despite that fact, this is a surprisingly faithful and playable port. Again, the gameplay is more or less intact, though obviously more limited. The characters actually look pretty good and animate well, and the music for a Game Boy game makes an admirable attempt to recreate what we heard in the arcade and on the SNES. Overall, not a bad port at all, but nothing could ever touch what was available in the arcades. Eventually, KI did make its way to the N64 in the form of Killer Instinct Gold in 1996, which itself was a modified port of Killer Instinct 2, which was released in arcades earlier that year. In terms of gameplay, KI2 and Gold stick to what worked in the first game, feeling more like a big update rather than a completely new game, featuring some new characters, including a new final boss, and bringing back most of the fan favorites from the first game. It's also fleshed out with some additional gameplay modes, including a much appreciated practice mode for working on combos, and a team battle mode, which is especially cool. The graphics were quite good on the N64, though again not quite reaching the level of the arcade, and the soundtrack also didn't sound quite the same with the N64 sound font. But all in all, this was a kick-ass port. And with there being so few fighting games on the N64 and even fewer that are actually worth playing, KI Gold was certainly a welcome addition to the library. And for the longest time, that was the last anyone ever heard of Killer Instinct.
Fight on! Killer Instinct.
It only took 17 years, but eventually in 2013 we received a brand new Killer Instinct game for the Xbox One, cleverly titled Killer Instinct. It brought back all of the series' most popular characters and faithfully recreated the gameplay of the original games, while also tossing in some cool new features such as unique super abilities for each character, and new gameplay modes such as the Dojo, which teaches very meticulously how to play KI, and the Shadow Lab, which creates custom shadow opponents based on your playstyle and then lets you test your skills against an opponent who is exactly as good as you are. It's still Killer Instinct though, so of course it had to have some awesome graphics, which 11 years on still look pretty good, plus we got an all-new soundtrack that remixes some old favorites and throws in some excellent original tracks as well. And of course, no KI game is complete without an extremely enthusiastic announcer screaming adjectives at you while you play. Yes, indeed, this version of Killer Instinct was truly a return to form, and though there's yet to be an announcement for a follow-up game, this one has received numerous updates over the years and is still readily available for anyone who wants to kick some ass, KI style.
Awesome victory!
Regardless of what the future holds for Killer Instinct, it has already cemented its legacy in the storied history of fighting games, giving us amazing gameplay, memorable characters, and music that will stick with us until our dying days. And it all started in 1994, when a side project became a tech demo, became an all-time classic fighting game that I can still go back to any day of the week. And it certainly stood out from the crowd. Some of us were Street Fighter kids, and some of us were squarely in the Mortal Kombat camp. But no matter where you stood, there could be no denying that Killer Instinct was
Awesome!
Killer Instinct. Playtime is over.